one of the things that is great about the Life Process program is nobody's forced into it. We've made it as convenient as possible. It's consumer oriented. It's there to help you. If you don't want it, you don't have to have it. You know, it's as voluntary as you can get. You know, we don't know your home telephone number, and we're not associated, obviously, with any court. And so that's very, I think that's a value all of us share in the Life Process program operation, and Zach and I share. We're consumer oriented. If we can be helpful, we're glad to be helpful. So an issue that has struck us, well, let me pose the question. Do you feel the disease concept of addiction is associated with coercion and coercive treatment?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I do 100%. And, you know, it covers the whole field. You know, if you're saying, well, somebody's going to hurt themselves, I have to force them into treatment. They have a disease, they can't control themselves. We're very, I mean, you know, people can hurt themselves and we want to help them, but we're very resistant to that kind of coercion. But a strange flip side has appeared where, and it helps us to explore the concept of the disease concept and voluntarism and self-efficacy, putting yourself into the situation where you want to change, which is this. In a famous case, namely a woman named Joyce Eldred in Massachusetts, the people who were defending her imprisonment were the anti-disease people. And that just seems to be a strange corner to be backed into. And me personally, I guess I just want to voice a protest or to stick my hand up and say, this isn't the way that I want to go with our approach, but maybe it'll help clarify some issues. So Joyce Eldred, and did you want to throw anything in there, or should I keep moving along here?
No, but I was going to ask you to describe what the Massachusetts Supreme Court case was. Sounds like you're about to dive in.
Joyce Eldred, in 2016, she was sentenced for theft. She stole some jewelry, and the jewelry was stolen in connection with her drug use, which I read was heroin, although that doesn't appear again. Her probation, and people must be aware of this, included a requirement to remain drug-free. Often, when they put you on probation for a crime, probation means they don't put you in jail. They say, well, look, we're going to give you another shot. And they don't want you to use drugs.
Are we stopping right there and saying that is not linear? Saying, all right, you stole jewelry, now you have to remain drug-free. I understand how they got there and their logic, but
why don't you throw your 2 cents in there, or how you're reacting to that?
Well, I guess the assumption was made, or maybe she said it outright, that the jewelry was stolen to account for her heroin habit or whatever it was. I think fentanyl.
That was the crime, yeah.
Okay, and so there was supposed to be some sort of a logical punishment that part of probation, which often it is, and this is just blanket, was that under the conditions of her release, she has to pass urine screens and she has to be drug free. And to me, I don't like that system. I don't think I don't think it follows that using drugs is tantamount to her stealing jewelry again, which was the crime she was committed of.
Well, thanks for expressing that. I agree 100%. And the problem is, it's putting the state being the court, this is Massachusetts, into the business of you're taking drugs. I mean, you and I, you're not allowed to steal jewelry. You're not allowed to commit robberies. You're not allowed to hurt people. Okay, we're 100%, we're all for that. And then Well, I mean, and who decided that she did the theft for the drugs? We just take that on faith. I mean, maybe she was just having trouble paying her rent in general.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's because she's spending money on drugs. But we don't know any of that. And so I think I can express my point of view, which is obviously you can say, well, it wasn't a major crime. Nobody was hurt. You don't have a record, probably. We're going to put you on probation and we want you to function successfully. Obviously, there were thefts or other criminal activity. We want you to show up on time and we want you to show that you're meeting certain kinds of responsibilities, paying your rent or whatever. That might imply getting a job. So you and I want to separate the criminal justice system entirely from issues of whether a person takes drugs or not.
Yeah, and I mean, even if the state of Massachusetts wanted to know that she wasn't going to be using drugs destructively anymore, if there was a reasonable basis for that, still using drugs responsibly is not the same as never using drugs. So I still don't think it follows, even if if you landed somewhere where you could make an argument that her drug use should be monitored, and it made sense. Having some positive urine analysis, positive for heroin, fentanyl, whatever it is, or I guess any drug in her case, it doesn't follow me that you could make that assessment based on the urine screen that she was not improving.
Well, I agree with you. And that's a pretty radical idea. And often alcohol is thrown in there.
Mm-hmm.
So that, alcohol is a legal substance. And you're not allowed to, in these cases, I've seen these cases many times, you're not allowed to go and say, I don't have any problems. I've never had any problems with red wine with dinner. It's kind of part of my routine.
Right.
They frequently throw alcohol in the mix because we're a temperance country. So I agree with you 100%, but that's a remarkably radical concept, as this discussion perhaps will show. She tested positive for fentanyl. She was on buprenorphine. So she was already, probation is going to include nearly always some kind of treatment thing. And, again, it's coercion because they're saying to you, well, if you don't go into treatment, you can go to jail. So we're into two levels of coercion. You can go to jail and you've got to do this treatment. And she tested positive for fentanyl. That's why I'm wondering, I read the case and her monkey was heroin, but she seemed to want to take fentanyl while she was on bupe. So she violated her probation and she was sentenced to go to prison and it only lasted about a week. And then they let her out again and they did all of the same stuff. They put her back on buprenorphine, but they adjusted the dose. It's not a very good argument for how good MOUD is, what I mean? And they put her in an intensive outpatient program, which is where they bombard you with, in my experience, 12-step stuff. So the case was taken to the Massachusetts Supreme Court in 2018. And the argument was made that she couldn't resist taking drugs because she had a chronic relapsing brain disease. It was a disease defense. Now, at the point that this happens, they're trying to make a point because the whole case is actually going by the wayside. She's already out of prison. She's already doing something. So the lawyers want to go and say, well, you can't put somebody in prison for taking a drug because she has a disease and can't help taking the drug.
And so she effectively became the poster child for the chronic relapsing brain disease.
She did.
Yeah.
Sarah Wakeman's a famous, I think, Harvard physician. Her first line on her brief is, addiction is a chronic relapsing brain disease. So enter into the picture there's something called an amicus brief, which is you're not a party in any of this and nobody asked you, but you're going to write a brief in support of imprisonment and coerced treatment. Whew. I mean, that's a tough brief to write. And it was written by a group of people. 4 of them are contributors to assessing the brain disease model of addiction, which is an anti-disease model book. And those 4 people, as I'm aware, are Sally Satel, Fred Rogers, Gene Heyman, and Stephen Morse. So I don't know. Can you jump ahead and say what their argument is?
Well, I think they only had to argue. The idea was to argue against the folly of the brain disease model, not so much. That
play into? Yeah. Okay, put her in jail.
Right. So first, debunking the brain disease myth. Well, people respond to contingencies. Right. That's the idea. So slap somebody on the wrist, they might not do something again. It's not like people don't have their faculties about them while they're using drugs. So sort of debunk the brain disease notion. And then they say, it's not crazy to say put somebody in jail for the remainder of their sentence because that's a deterrent.
You're getting down to something essential.
Mm-hmm.
She was in jail for robbery.
Yeah.
They didn't pick her up off the street and say, oh, you're taking a drug, we're putting you in jail. She was on probation for robbery.
Right.
And the probation included not taking drugs, which you and I have already said we don't. Why is that in there?
Right.
You put her in jail again if she gets drives recklessly, she takes drugs and drinks and drives reckless. Regular stuff.
If I had to be an advocate for these folks that wrote the brief, I mean, we know they're all brilliant. Here's what I would guess. Here's what I would say on their behalf. They maybe don't make the link. It's possible that there's some ambiguity that the robbery and the drug use were associated, but it seems like they were. And after all, this is no longer a good faith actor. So this person's in no position to say, well, the drug use has nothing to do with it, or I'm getting better with my drug use. The state of Massachusetts needs to worry that if somebody is using drugs destructively and it's led them to do things like robbing places, that the onus is on the state to go ahead and link those things just in case. And that might be totally simplifying, and maybe they wouldn't make that claim, but I think that's where they're in the ballpark of what they're saying.
Well, if I were to make their argument for them in the most simple terms, Sally Satel and Gene Heyman, I know, people stop taking drugs when it causes them problems.
That's the general argument, yes.
Jail is a problem. So let's throw in jail. And then that's one of the problems that they'll weigh in the future. So that's a big topic. I mean, you would have a ton to say on that, I think.
That's their argument. What I mean is you and I might wonder.
Why don't you switch to how you react to the idea of punishing people? I mean, strictly speaking, negative events do impact your drug choice. But why would we not come in on the side of, well, let's do more bad things to them so they'll stop taking drugs?
Well, just to return to that last thing, what you just said is their general argument, people in general. And I guess that's what a Supreme Court case kind of is. But you and I might wonder, like, well, how could someone justify being so boosterish about something like jail? And that's what I meant, is that this could be their justification. Well, she's no longer somebody in this position is no longer a good faith actor. There's no reason that the state has to burden themselves with getting down to the nitty gritty and nuance of wondering if they can continue taking drugs and still be a good citizen.
But I think they're using addiction theory. I think they're saying it makes sense. Instead of saying they have a brain disease and can't help themselves, they can make a choice. Let's help them make the choice. This is a bad choice.
Yeah. No, I get it.
So why would we not use that kind of negative? We don't have that power in the life process program to do anything bad to you. But why does that whole argument not work for us in terms of working with a person with some variety of addictive problem?
Somebody's motivations don't tend to come from a force imposed on them. I mean, sometimes it could work. Sometimes when you're rearing children, for example, that the idea that you have to have, these external forces and restrictions, that can sometimes help the frame of development. But overall, the idea that if you really want somebody to better themselves so that they make better decisions for themselves and for society, that somebody who doesn't know them, or somebody who doesn't understand them, or somebody who's not in their mind, so anybody, the idea that you can just impose something on them, it just doesn't work. It's not going to pan out in a statistically relevant way.
I think that really comes up a lot with kids. I know it's your way of thinking with kids. You don't want to punish kids into compliance as a general rule of thumb. It's got its limits. I mean, you do set up boundaries, but your whole concept and the concept of the life process program and our whole model of addiction is, well, let's get them engaged in positive things. And especially when you think of children, so they'll want to do that as opposed to, negative things or being overcome by drugs to the point where they have to steal. We're very biased in the direction of opening opportunities. It really rubs us the wrong way to say, addiction is and drug use, bad drug use involves rewards and punishments. We don't want to come in on the punishment side. But then there's one last irony. So they're against the disease model, but they're arguing in court that it's fair to put Miss Eldred in jail with the whole goal of this Michigas is to put her in treatment again. As I said, it's already, you're saying, isn't that what got her here? So how good is that? They put her back in MOUD. They put her back in medication for opioid use dependence. So this group of stalwarts, this group of worthies who are arguing against the disease model, in effect, are forcing somebody into two separate disease treatments, the intensive outpatient program and the BUP program.
And here's where I'm going to come back with my point. If I'm trying to wear their shoes for a minute, they're not going to see their statement, especially about this particular case, as the same kind of coercion that would take place if a person was floundering in life in general and had not been arrested for something. I'll take Sally, for example. I think that she has a level of compassion to her work that would say people shouldn't be forced into treatment. And I think that there is an idea out there. It's like I think I said to you in an email, it's like on the spectrum of disgust. There's a yuckiness to somebody who's messing with the law, getting themselves starting to rub off on society in a negative way, where a person of this mind, I'm talking about the people who wrote the brief, could say, maybe it's coercion, but hasn't this person lost their right to be able to choose this thing? Whereas I don't think they think everybody has lost the right to choose this thing. So it's an interesting.
I mean, but then the irony that they're opponents of the disease theory, and it so happens that in the vast majority of cases, you're going to get forced into a diseasey kind of treatment.
Yeah, I see. I understand what you're saying. The idea that we're against the disease theory, and for all these reasons, and we, on the other hand, think that deterrence help people, and then if something bad happens to them, then they'll get better. Except this is not what really is being argued, because the deterrent includes a subsequent treatment program, and the treatment program for what? It's not for nothing. That's not a deterrent. That's part of the whole disease phenomenon.
and we don't want to be the deterrent. We want them to have a positive life experience. So the whole thing, for several reasons, it rubs us the wrong way.
Yeah.
Now, I happen to know, Sally Sattel and Fred Rogers. I know of Gene Haman's great work where he basically shows, well, people quit drugs on the one hand for negative reasons, but then his bottom line is Gene Haman will say something like, ultimately, people stop taking drugs addictively or stop taking drugs because it puts them in a place of being a person they don't want to be in terms of how they see themselves and the respect of their family, which is a whole different statement. It's a more subtle statement than saying, oh, well, they saw him in jail. Now, it so happens, I named 3 people that I more or less know. One of the people who argues this is a lawyer named Stephen J. Morse. I'll read a brief defense or explanation, just a sentence, his outlook. Many have argued that opioid addicts have no meaningful choice about whether to use and so cannot be held criminally responsible for their actions. This is simply not true. So, that's where he's coming from. And once again, maybe this will get back more to your point. I have personally testified in cases. In one case, a cocaine guy and his partner murdered his dealer and the dealer's girlfriend for his cocaine. And the defense team said, well, he couldn't control his drug use. I'll just have to tell a little vignette. This happened in Mississippi. And the lawyers for the defendant, she said, are you going to tell me that my mother who quit smoking hasn't woken up every day for 12 years thinking about getting a cigarette? And I said, and would she kill somebody and cut off their head and hands to get one, your mother? And the attorney spun around. This is not before the jury. This is called, this is where they're clearing me as an expert. And I just have to do the judge says, well, this has been it's called voir dire, where they're qualifying me. At the end, the judge didn't say anything all along. He said, at the time, DSM-4 was the operational manual. It's now DSM-5. Well, it's going to be hard for me to say that Dr. Peel isn't a qualified expert if he wrote the book that we're all referring to. A little strong saying I wrote the book, was a contributor to the book. And they said, and I don't think I need to tell all of you that when the jury's actually here, we expect a little bit better deportment from you all. No spinning around when I give an answer. So, if you kill somebody, you and I are going to say, taking drugs, not a defense. We're 100% with Stephen Morse on that. But we're in a whole different bailiwick in this case. The Joyce Eldred case. So I was going to pass the baton along to you. I actually have quite a long relationship with both Sally Sattel and Fred Rogers. I've actually used Fred Rogers when I was a lawyer as an expert in a case. And I don't know if I know Sally forever, but we've been on the same side of the arguments basically for quite decades. And then a little bit later in life, as is appropriate to your age, you ran into Stephen Morse. Do you want to just run with it for a couple of minutes here?
Well, yeah, first, I think Stephen Morse is brilliant. And like you say, you and he would completely agree on the topic of your case and your testimony on it. He talks about free will a lot and, sort of pushes back on the idea that free will is an illusion kind of a thing. He says maybe in some nuanced physics realm it's not, but we need to operate, at least me in law and psychology, as though we have free will, and it's a thing that and even when we're impaired on drugs or claim mental illness or something, the only way to look at that is through a folk psychological lens. or as you and I say, just total common sense. That's what you can see, what you can feel empirically. And so he and I actually spoke on a panel with Sally. It was for drug court, and I wound up talking a lot. There are topics that were brought up, and I sort of this razor's edge that's the argument between the disease theory, but then also like Stephen Morse and Sally Satel. I found myself constantly walking on and wanting to get my point out. And I apologized to him after. Actually, for instance, he said the thing about, well, addiction could be heritable. Addiction can be some percent genetic, but look, we need to focus on what actually can be changed in a person's life when somebody asked a question about that. And so I actually pushed back on that, and I gave him a much more let's call it a radical. What is Adi Jaffe call you? A radical environmentalist?
Yes.
So I gave that I gave that sort of an answer, and there were a lot of things like that. And afterwards, he wanted a copy of the book, and people were up buying the book, and a couple of people asked me to sign it, and he said, "You know what? This is good for you. I'm going to buy the book wholesale." And
Guy.
So and then I thought, well, either that was passive aggressive or that was really nice. I don't know, but I should email him. And so I thanked him, and I said, I hope. It wound up being actually was a genuine good gesture, and I emailed him and I said, I'm sorry if I was taking over the stage or if I was talking too much. I mean, I am kind of no one in their minds until that morning when he met me. And, he's this professor, Ivy League professor who's been talking about this a long time. And he said, by no means did you talk too much, and you were brilliant, and it was great. And so we had this correspondence, and we talked back and forth. And I don't remember exactly what it was that brought it up, but I think it was the DPA did something, and I thought, oh, wow, this is the DPA doing something thoughtful. And it was something like not using the disease argument, and on the other hand, not coercing. It was somewhere in that realm. I don't remember exactly what it was. And ever since that, he said,
I wrote a brief. I am also a lawyer. I'm not as I have some lawyerly skills, questioning people. I'm not good at writing briefs. It's not my style. I wrote a brief where I believe I was the only amicus brief sent in to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, which said what you said. And DPA said they were going to do what you said, which is to say, we're not arguing for the disease theory. As you and I have been expressing, we don't think people should go be placed incarcerated under any circumstances in connection with drug use. That was the argument against which they wrote their brief. So I could have predicted perhaps you would ruffle his feathers with that one.
So he said, so they did something that that's almost like made up for this whole pushing backing the brain disease idea in the Eldred case. And so I sent him an article, or maybe it was a statement DPA made. I said, did you see this? So, and the way you think about it, and also me, this would be a step in the right direction. And he wrote back, I did see this. By no means do I think it's a step in the right direction. Whoops. And that was the last. I mean, I don't know, maybe he's just busy, but he stopped being interested in corresponding. So, I thought that was interesting. It's an area where I thought this is like obvious, but yeah, he's, he and others are shut down.
I mean, I always refer to this. You like to object without being objectionable. You feel that you could make your point without stepping on people's toes. It's, I think, typical of you to write an email saying, oh, maybe I hope I didn't, step on your toes during this panel. But you stand up for certain points of view. You're not going to go along with something that you oppose. You're going to make a clear statement you're going to object. In this case, you're going to support what DPA said without being objectionable. And that turned out not to be possible. So the whole paradox here is that if we conceivably could have written something for assessing the brain disease model of addiction, which is what I am dedicated to debunking the brain disease model, and yet some of its biggest stalwarts are endorsing a position that we're just, they couldn't drag us to go along with. We're not going to say, well, we're going to put this person in jail because they used a drug. We're going to say there are certain things you can require. I mean, we sound like libertarians. You can require a person, not to pay, not to commit crimes. If you can compel them to make restitution. You can compel them to fulfill certain legal obligations, parental and other, and pay their bills. But you and I don't think it's the job of the state to say, oh, and remember, they're the anti-disease guys. And yet they're saying, well, they don't have a disease, put them in jail for using drugs. Or force, which is essentially forcing them into treatment. And, as we began this little discussion, that seems to us the disease argument. Oh, they have a disease, they can't control themselves, force them to go into treatment. It seems like they're the biggest supporters of what we see to be one of the negative pillars of the whole disease and treatment model.
So what should they do if they think that Congress should, write to put something into effect where, or, however it goes up the ranks, where coerced treatment shouldn't be part of the judicial system? So you could just imagine all those writers of the amicus brief believe that, but they at the same time they say, well, this is what we're working with, and so the deterrent thing is what we'll argue for. I mean, what should they have done? Should they not have written the brief, or should they have added something in there? I guess to.
Well, I mean,
and I don't know if that's what they believe.
The EPA said they were going to write, but didn't, and that I wrote. They could have taken a humane approach and said, this disease model is full of it, but we respectfully judge that, jail and forced treatment is not the response. By the way, we've mentioned in Oregon, they passed a referendum which says that you can't be arrested and in prison strictly for personal use of any drug. Mm-hmm. However, they have a triage where they send you when you're arrested, and they determine whether you require treatment. Now, I think we've gone over this. You and I would say, well, don't arrest them for personal drug use.
Right.
Arrest them for whatever, if they commit a crime. And Joyce Elder did steal. So they do have that over her. They didn't arrest her for using drugs. They arrested her for stealing. She's on probation. She's not a regular free human being. So we're in that little pit there. But in Oregon, if somehow you get caught with drugs or using drugs, but that's it, you haven't done anything other than that, we would say decriminalization means, and decriminalization in this case means they give them a summons. In our case, we would say, well, what are you searching them for drugs for if they haven't committed a crime? Or how did you find them using drugs if that's all they're doing? Did you go in their house and observe them using drugs? All of that doesn't register for us. We're for enforcing regular property and personal laws that exist, but throw out all laws connected to drug use.
I interviewed a guy named Tamler Summers, and he's not at all famous for this book. It's just he wrote a book that's by basic books, and it's actually not about restorative justice per se, but it's called In Defense of Honor. And in it, he talks about sort of some phenomena like this, where he would argue that someone is arrested for stealing, and it's by no means obvious that they're going to hurt somebody or kill somebody, whatever, that there is, rather than something like a probation for something that's not exactly linked to the crime that they committed, there is a way to maybe repair and restore with a society, something you could pull from what you would do in an honorable culture, in a culture that thrives on honor. And I do wonder if all of the writers of this brief, if something like that were in place, some sort of a restorative practice, or someone who steals, or someone who even commits a violent crime could go back and do something sensible and linked to the crime they committed to restore and repair between them and the rest of society, and especially directly to the people that they may have harmed. If they would have written the brief and said, well, this thing's in play, and so why are we including probation that says you have to be abstinent from drugs? I do wonder if it was already in effect, if all of those same people would.
The benefit of the doubt. I mean, you and I are both sympathetic to restorative justice. That's a thing. Mm-hmm. And the concept is, how much good does it put some young person, perhaps a minority, into prison?
Yeah.
And it costs money to do that. And then the person that you stole from is still hurt. Why not link you and them to doing something positive? That is a kind of a basic appeal. They're not arguing at that level. They're arguing on the basic theoretical meaning of disease of addiction to go in this direction.
I know that they are. I guess what I'm saying, they're not consciously arguing at that level. But I don't think they're basing their argument at that. They're comfortable enough with working within the framework that exists that they go ahead and push that deterrent thing. And it would be uncomfortable for them to say, well, look, people improve when they're able to take matters into their own hands and figure out what motivates them. And they're certainly not going to improve if they're coerced into something. They're comfortable with the framework that exists, and coercion's a better answer than what the opposite side is in this case. And I actually do believe, we're not going to agree on this, which is interesting, but I actually do believe that if the framework were different and more, like our persuasion, I think that their arguments would be similar. The theoretical framework of deterrence, okay, fine. But I think that with given two options, one that's totally restorative and sensible, and one that's jail time and coerced treatment, I think they would lean on the restorative and sensible. I just don't think that's well, there.
I read the brief. They didn't. The word restorative justice doesn't appear. It's leading them down the road by the nose.
But it's just not ubiquitous. That's what I mean. It's not leading them down the road by the nose. Exactly. They're not interested in going and burdening themselves with coming up with something that's restorative. It's just not. You're aware that Sally has spent maybe a year in kind of Ohio, maybe rural Ohio. Yeah.
Looking at the lives of people who become addicted to drugs, for shorthand.
Right.
That's I wouldn't, Sally works for the American Enterprise Institute, which is a kind of a right-wing kind of an operation. A crimes are crimes kind of a thing. Maybe doing this, the motivation to do this or the experience would make her a little, and she does work in a methadone or a heroin clinic. So maybe a part of her is opening up to, well, these people don't have good lives.
Yeah.
That's really where they're coming from.
It's bad. A lot of people have bad moral luck.
We don't like to put people in, we don't think it's a good idea to put people in jail who are already on the downside of the system. How does that really contribute to that? So you're saying maybe that Ohio thing came after this thing.
That's true. Yeah.
Let's give Sally the benefit of the doubt, and maybe down the road, a question for Sally would be: has your experience in rural Ohio softened your willingness to endorse criminal penalties?
Yeah, well, okay, last thing, the guy named John Pfaff, I think his name is, from Fordham University. wrote a book called Locked In. I think that's what it's called. And it's about, the reason people are in jail. Okay, it's true ethically that why are we arresting people for drug possession crimes? But even if you released all the people that were in jail for drug possession crimes, you would hardly notice the difference. It would still be, jail would still be overwhelmed. And so there needs to be, at some level, we need to stop drawing too many lines in the sand, because actually a lot of people who have experienced bad upbringings, bad moral luck, are in there for domestic crimes or assault crimes. And if you can actually look at them at a developmental level and say, if they were able to repair, restore, actually be connected with the community and have something worth living for, then the likelihood is that you would see a lot fewer people in jail and actually a lot more productive citizens. And that was a book that, that sounds a lot like us. And it was a book that AEI and a lot of right-wing, a lot of conservative think tanks and people were all okay with. John Pfaff later came out as came out's the right word, as a total lefty. But, a lot of the people on the right were interested in this book. And so I think I see the tide turning that direction, just not fast enough for someone like you and me.
It does have a sort of a biblical justice to it. By the way, if we're mentioning Fast book, we should mention our two books. You and I wrote Outgrowing Addiction instead of, what's the subtitle? Outgrowing Addiction. Point to it behind you.
With Common Sense Instead of Disease Therapy.
That's kind of where you and I are coming from. And I wrote my memoir. You have it on your right hand, which is
May as well hold on.
Life on the Edge, My Lonely Quest to Change How We See Addiction. All right, we've opened up a can of worms. Hopefully we haven't offended such great thinkers, but
no,
come down a little, as your little mishmash with Stephen Morse showed, you're not on the same page exactly on this one.
No. And I respect all these people, and I've learned a lot from all of them. Some of them I can't believe how thoughtful they've been. So whatever, maybe we have a disagreement, and that's an intellectually interesting thing about humans. So all good.
All right. So happy Sunday on the Life Process program.
All right, Stanton, take care.